Hi, everybody. I'm Dylan Canyon of Anderson, BC, formerly last year Anderson CE.
Hi, I'm Mark Foster from Anderson FK, formerly Anderson BF. And, I think Dylan's got some words for what's going on.
Right. So we're from Anderson High School, obviously, which is a public high school in Austin, Texas. And so what we wanted to do here was just create a sort of format where we could kind of increase the knowledge base of the community, make more arguments more accessible, spread knowledge about them. That way the entire community can benefit and we can get much better classroom debates and much higher quality debates and get more education out of the activity. So on this channel, we're going to be, talking about a lot of sectors of debate and just taking a deep dive. We're also talking about topics, doing a lot of evidence, looking at arguments. We're doing a lot of evidence research and whatnot. So it's going to be very in-depth about that. But so why? Why do we want to do this, Mark?
So I think a major part is a big issue in the recent years of PF is arguments have been getting more progressive, quicker. People are having a harder time to keep up with the education curve. So whenever you have a coach who's just used to being in traditional PF setting, it's really important that we provide a learning template for these people to actually get past that learning curve that exists. So whether or not is a coach that has to watch these videos or just a kid on a traditional PF team who wants to run an argument that's not usually read. Just the idea that they can expand their knowledge base is pretty much the goal of the channel.
Right, and so plans for the future. Basically, we would like to see this become more of a robust kind of knowledge base about PF. That way we can enhance everybody's understanding. And ideally, we would also just like to create but let's talk about what we're going to do in this first installment. We're going to be talking about theory. It's taking over the circuit. More teams are running it. We have begun to read more theory. And, we're seeing a lot of things like disclosure happening. So I think we should really just get into what is theory, why is it in debate, and, all these specifics.
All right, yeah, so we'll move over to the slideshow. I'm sorry about the cheesy banner that we have. It's, we're not all going to be paying for these high-quality graphics. So, yeah, we're PF Forward. That's just the name of the channel. Just kind of off the dome. We'll move on. So, what is theory? Theory is the establishment of a rule or norm within a debate round, and it is often enforced against another debater for an abuse or just overall an argument over the actual debate space ethics.
Absolutely. So it's kind of used as an enforcement mechanism, a means of getting people to comply with a given norm that a debater deems to be important to the education or fairness or inclusivity of debate as a whole. So let's get into specifically each part of theory because it's very important. It's very technical. You have to know how to respond and how to engage with theory. And so
yeah. Just to make sure y'all are able to really capture what theory is. A really common example of theory in PF that is almost read every round is that you shouldn't read new arguments in rebuttal, or not rebuttal, read new arguments in summary. Mm-hmm. There's a general consensus that you do not read new arguments in the final two speeches, and that is really enforced in debate rounds via drop the argument theory that we will quickly be to explain towards the end of the video. Mm-hmm. So people are already reading theory. Yeah. It's just a matter of formalizing the process. That way we can get rid of all the muddling that surrounds it.
Absolutely. Like Mark says, these are norms that everyone kind of mutually accepts. It's yeah, of course you do this. But if you just look at the rule book of debate, there's a lot of things that are not in there that everybody agrees to. And that is sort of the goal of theory, right? These are just issues that have progressed over time because people deem them to be abuses or systematic problems within debate and they were checked back, right? It's not like when public forum was established where everyone was saying that you can never bring up any new arguments of final focus or that there was certain technicalities of summary, right? This is exactly the goal of what theory is. So I think people make it a lot stranger than it is, but I do think that it has played a big part in debate and likely will have a part in public forum as we're seeing it be used increasingly.
And we will discuss how theory can be a good thing in public forum. Because the truth is, a lot of people see theory in LD as really being this thing that came into the event and took all the education out and made it all semantic based. But the truth is, that's just due to the lack of preparation for theory in existence. LD wasn't planning on debaters to run theory, so there's always going to be the like built-in fact that LD is compatible with theory. But PF in its own time structures is actually constricted in a way that will explain to you betters the quality of theory uniquely, as long as people are willing to accept to certain norms that can make the debate space better, not only based on theory but in plenty of other areas. So let's get down to like the very specifics of a theory shell. So we have interpretation, violation, standards, and voters. And of course, you can terminalize this. That's usually what you have to do. And then we'll get to like RVIs, competing interps, other like extra jargon that you'll definitely be hearing every time you run theory. First is going to be your interpretation.
So basically, this is what debaters must do, right? It's saying debaters must have a certain type of case, must do a certain thing like disclose, or debaters must not miscut evidence. We'll get into that, right? State rule to impose upon debate.
So like a really important thing is when you make a rule, make sure it's not just about like a moral obligation, but it is a demand that imposes like punishment if it is not met. Because interpretations means that you are like you're coming out here to set a norm that you believe should exist in all debate rounds, which means that in order for that norm to exist, you have to set the norm is requiring something of the person, not that it's recommending. That is like a semantic thing that pops up in LD that you should just preemptively not participate in that debate by just avoiding it in general. So like a primary example of an interpretation that's going to be pretty much consistent with the rest of the arguments we show you is going to be debaters may not introduce new offense or blocks in summary or final focus. So this pretty much just means no new arguments in the final two speeches, as we discussed a pretty decently or like very much present norm that like everyone pretty much concedes.
So let's talk about the violation, which is the next part. So this is basically how the opponent breaks the norm or the interpretation, right? Just ways in which they did not follow this rule, they broke the rule in some capacity. So whether it be an opponent did not disclose their case, and you should all times provide accurate examples and proof that this is true, right? Don't be reading like frivolous theory or just something like it's like completely lying about it, because that's very toxic to debate. I think it should really only be used to check back legitimate abuse, and so there should be a lot of proof for that. So something that happened, but also like how they violated, and that's kind of just it's pretty simple portion of theory, but it's a very important one.
Especially whenever you consider that judges, whenever they consider violations, definitely are going to lean more towards reasonability and their own feeling of whether or not you violated. Because the violation, specifically in an event like PF where people are like clearly not trying to make a semantic debate, you're going to end up with like more judges that are willing or like more perceptive towards like generally they broke a rule we set. You don't really need to provide these accurate examples, but it is always important that you provide them just in case, because you might get like a policy or LD judge whose threshold for violation is like completely different. All right, so like an example here is like our opponents read a new delinquent case. The X, I'm specifying which argument, was never mentioned before this. That meant to say speech. Yeah, that's whatever. So next, let's move on to standards.
So standards, in a lot of ways, could be considered the most important or maybe the most frequently debated, right? Because the standards is sort of like the warrant for theory, right? If the interpretation is the claim, like debaters must do something, standards is why this is very good for them to do. And so with that being said, there's a broad array of what standards are, but basically it's the warrant for how the interpretation makes debate better, and it includes a lot of things. So I think we're going to get in depth, or talk in depth about a lot of kinds of standards, the most common ones you'll hear.
Yeah, so like let's go with the example of not running new arguments in like summary and final focus. We really give you the point of clash, as like running new arguments in late round can entirely dodging interaction with pre-research responses and voids clash while the time provides to respond. This means debate is less in-depth and in turn less educational, because what is universally recognized is that if you're going into a debate and getting actual blocks to your argument, you have to be able to respond to them in order to have a true understanding of what your argument means. Because otherwise you're only like experiencing the surface level education that you could be getting if you just were to like look into front lines. Because like that is way more advantageous in the world where you can't just read new responses in summary or final focus. So it encourages better clash.
Absolutely. And another standard that could be run on this is the idea of time skew, right? if my opponent makes a brand new response and first final focus, that does not give me a lot of time to interact with this response, respond adequately, and and that is unfair, right? That's like a reason independently as to why someone should not or should follow the interpretation. So that's another one, right? If I have less time to respond to something, I have less of an ability to, and that is fundamentally unfair. So that would violate, or that would be a reason why interpretation is correct.
And like another one would be like strategy skew. So a skew, pretty much like it is considered in real life, it would be that of which you are no longer having an equal amount of. So when you go into a debate round, the general idea is that all debaters should be structurally equivalent when they debate. It should be who is the better debater that wins. Not someone who cheats around education, but someone who just straight up was better, they had better arguments, they were able to articulate the arguments to the judge, they were more persuasive. Those are the teams that deserve to win. So a strategy skew would proclaim that now there is an extreme difference in strategical opportunities for our opponents, because now they can run new responses in summary and we didn't. That means that we were abiding by the better norm, and now we're being punished for it because they ran a new argument in summary that allows them to have more offense or more defense than we had the opportunity to place. Because I guarantee you, if we were able to read the same amount of responses back, it would have not have been as such big of a time skew or a strategy skew. So strategy skew, time skew, those are very closely tied standards. That's just something to really take into account.
All right, so another one, evidence comparison. This one comes up quite a bit, frequently with things like disclosure, right? Because the argument would be, if someone's case is disclosed, then you can really check the quality of the evidence in more depth than you could if you just called for a card. Or you could read it, while they're giving a speech or while a partner's giving a speech. You don't have to call for evidence. But basically, it enables you to better analyze the evidence and ensure that it is high quality rather than poor evidence with poor warranting or something that is compliant finds the complete opposite conclusion. So if you have more time and more of a capacity to compare evidence, you're likely to encourage better evidence ethics, right? Because if someone can see your case ahead of time and you have a card that is completely misconstrued, it's a lot more likely to get called out, and as such, you can't use evidence like that. That's sort of the idea.
And another idea on the grounds of evidence comparison, a really good example of this was on the pharmaceutical topic of last year, where there was an argument where research and development, there were studies on both sides that forced us to have to analyze which evidence was reaching that conclusion through the better methodology. And the truth is, if you are not going through every single study that exists on that topic, you're not going to be able to write enough indicts. You're not going to be able to write enough comparisons to your own evidence, which is why it's important that we're able to have more time to do such evidence comparison, as it allows us to unravel the real effects of the policy, thus making it more educational, and that, again, is a voter that we can get to in the next core part of the theory shell.
Absolutely. So the last one we're going to talk about is research, which is basically that it encourages more in-depth research, more higher quality research. And the reason for this, often read, is with disclosure. If your case is on the wall for everyone to see, and people find a lot of responses to it, well, the argument probably wasn't very true. So it encourages you to look for better arguments with better links. That way, even if you put it on the wall for everyone to see, you would still be able to win it.
And also, since you only disclose previously read positions, it also encourages you to write more cases. That way people can't just spend all 15 minutes prepping out a single case. They're more likely to have to split that time up more to actually address each one. And since all your cases are probably going to be sharing a lot of common evidence, it's very clear that the disclosure still is able to solve back. And that's a norm we can see in LD, which is a really important tool that you should establish whenever you're utilizing theory. You should always be able to be look at the norm. It was established in LD, and now it's made the event better. You can look at disclosure. If someone's going to read a bunch of diss ads to you, you can use LD as empirics to block their diss ads. Big schools, Parker Whitful, the only LDer from his school, was able to win the TOC. He was a small school succeeding in a debate that had disclosure. So that just disproves empirically all of pretty much your opponent's defense. So that is also a really good way of truth testing your theory shell. If the norm exists in LD, then it's probably good.
Now, I just want to clarify. Now, we do believe that disclosure is an on-net good, but that doesn't mean that's the only way to interact with debate, right? It's not like if someone reads disclosure theory on you, oh, well, they're right, we lose. No. The beauty of theory is that clash on it is actually more accessible than traditional debate, I think. Because once you understand theory, and that does take some time, everything you say against your opponent is just your logical analysis over theirs, right? There's a lot of evidence that says things maybe are exaggerated, not exactly true. That goes out the window. All that is left is just your logical comparison, and I think that is where you would get the really the highest quality of clash, because you really have to interact with everything they're saying. So someone, can make very logical reasons as to why, any sort of theory is bad, or why something they're saying is wrong, right? There's two sides to everything. And I think that's a unique aspect in which theory thrives, because it encourages really high quality debate, because you really have to, use your own ability to think for it. And it creates a lot more critical thinking, I think.
Yeah, and especially, I think people in PF really exaggerate the learning curve surrounding theory. It's not super high, it's just that once you get a basic introduction, your own logical and critical thinking is able to foster better arguments, even if it's against frivolous shells. For example, I am a firm believer in RVIs because I will always concede them, because I think theory should be ethical. And you can probably win the RVI's ethical argument almost every round. So it's really important that you're actually choosing the arguments that are quality, or else you're probably going to be checked back against a community that is already against that theory shell.
All right, so another very big one, and sort of the thing you have to go for to win on theory, is voters. So,
all right, so here we go, voters.
The two you're probably going to counter most often are education and fairness, and there's a lot of places where they intersect. But the idea behind the education voter is, sorry, Mark, you can go.
I was just going to read what we have on there. It's only true long-term benefit to debate is education, as it fosters critical thinking and research, which are both portable skills that benefit us in the real world. Portable skill just meaning something that you can take from debate and use in your real life.
Right, like public speaking, critical thinking, research. So the inherent reason why we do debate is because we gain these skills. Right? It's not like people want to spend, months or days and days of their life at tournaments in the early morning, right, for nothing, right? They do it because they like what they're doing, they enjoy the skills they gain. And so if debate's not educational, nobody would be in debate. So obviously, education is of the utmost priority when it comes to maintaining debate.
But you could also make the same argument in consideration to fairness. Fairness is the idea that debaters will only participate in debate if they perceive it's fair. Otherwise, debaters won't have the incentive to invest time or even show up to tournaments. What this means is that if you know you're going to lose, even if you're running the better argument, you're still going to get dropped because your opponent is abusive. So fairness can also be considered an internal link to education, as it is you must be present to gain the actual education. So if no one's participating in an educational event, it makes no real difference. You have to consider fairness as a prerequisite. Now, of course, you can always weigh the fact that education is ultimately the only benefit of participation. This is a really, really broad topic that has been consistently debated and...
Right, but that's the beauty of theory, right? There's so many avenues for debate. So, sure, right now it seems like a cheap win because not a lot of people know how to respond to it. But I think if theory becomes widespread, it may not even be the most effective way to win, because there's so much ground for debate on everything, and there's unlikely to be, a moral consensus. So it encourages a lot of clash, and I think there's a lot of places where you can go for education or fairness. But I think one we're not including on here is inclusivity. And I think it's tied to fairness, but not exactly the same.
Yeah, so for example, inclusivity as a voter, yes, if you hurt smaller schools more, it's unfair for them. So not only do you you fuel the impact of fairness even more than your other standards, but you also gain the ability to say, you are marginalizing a group of people with their own perspectives. We should have a shared perspective in debate. That way we can really live our lives in a way that we're able to consider the vast variety of perspectives that exist, instead of just living in our own, what did you call it? Echo chamber. Yeah, that's a beautiful thing of switch side debate, is you also have to debate against arguments you might like. So you have to always take in the opposite perspective, and especially when that person's perspective may be the one of a person who goes to a poorer or smaller school, making inclusivity a pretty big deal.
Mm-hmm. So, even after you get the voters, right? Even if education happens, you agreed that this is important to education, what does that mean? Why does that matter? This is where terminalization for theory comes in they're pretty important. So basically, the idea is theory is a rule. You must set this rule, but for rules to truly be enforced, you need a punishment to a rule, right? The reason why laws are effective is because if you break the law, you're going to go to prison. So that's the same idea with theory, that you need to find a way to encourage the norm, or else no one will follow it. So that is the essence of what these two terminalizations commonly are: drop the debater or drop the argument.
Mm-hmm. So like what he's saying is pretty much, if theory is supposed to be an enforcement mechanism, one must provide a method of enforcement. So there are two: drop the debater being vote that debater down for his abuse because it sets a norm, or like there are plenty of other reasons, like the round is unfair, you should, like, as a judge, preserve fairness for the warrants given to the voters. That's just like presumed. And then of course the second kind being drop the argument. Drop the argument is like what we most often hear as hidden theory in PF, which is like our opponents read a new argument in summary. We don't we even do say it verbatim, actually. We say drop the argument as it's new in summary. That's the thing that everyone like pretty much knows verbatim in their head to say. It's just they don't know where it derives from, and that's from a theory terminalization. You are saying it's unfair, you're saying it's abusive, and you're saying to drop the argument. So all it does is, like, for example, if you read disclosure, to drop the argument would to be drop everything that isn't disclosed in their constructive, which would be their case. So you can easily find that drop the argument and drop the debater often are the same thing. It just really depends on the specific scenario. All right. Last,
so we're
going to get to some like extra jargon and things that surrounds the debate, and these are often highly contested topics.
So everything we just covered was kind of the general thesis of the argument, and here's where you get into the the more technical aspects. And this would be how, like, to give an analogy or comparison, and a normal case or normal argument. This would be the sort of thing like front lines to your arguments, or ways that your argument could short circuit another person's case, stuff like that, but with the theory version. So the first one we're going to get into is something called competing interps versus reasonability. So the thesis of this is basically saying that someone should respond to theory in a certain way, either with competing interps or reasonability. So yeah.
All right, so I'll start with competing interpretations, as that's pretty common as the outcome. So competing interpretations is the idea that the debater who is responding to theory must establish a clear counter to the argument that he provided. So here's an example. Let's move over to competing interps. Let's say my opponent says prefer competing interps. I would say debaters may read new arguments in summary and final focus. Notice how I say it's permitted that we read these new arguments, meaning it's at direct clash with their interpretation. Now, if you say debaters should read new arguments, that's a moral obligation versus a directive, which means that you're overall not going to be able to win any semantics debate there. I highly encourage you to just dodge doing that in the first place. It's stupid and it sucks. Let's have actual norm setting debates.
So one thing I think is important about this is not only, or this isn't, as a general concept of competing interps, you need sort of, like, if we agree that is what's going to happen in the round, then you need to respond with your counter interpretation, right? Like a interpretation saying the opposite. But like their case, you either would link into the standards, or you need to, and voters, or establish your own, because your competing interp doesn't mean a whole lot if it's outweighed by them, right? If Mark reads an interp saying debaters must not, or debaters must disclose, and I say debaters shouldn't disclose, but he reads 3 reasons why what he's saying is true and how that links into education and fairness, but I just kind of have one flimsy reason, he's going to win. Even though I did the competing interp, you still need to properly explain why your interpretation is a much better norm than theirs.
Yeah, and we'll definitely cover that more whenever we get to the actual,
specific arguments.
Yeah, specific arguments. And also, responding to theory, because that's a major tool in responding to theory, is providing a competing interp or fighting on reasonability. We'll definitely get to the debate between the two in a different video, because that is enough to take 30 minutes. But, so an example of me saying, prefer one of these two would be to say, prefer competing interpretations, as reasonability means a judge must intervene by establishing their own vision of the interp, which begs for intervention, which reduces clash. Clash is a prerequisite to fair debate, as I can't refute a RFD. So the idea is that the judge shouldn't be creating a competing interpretation, because you can never point out the flaws of it, because it only ever becomes clear what that judge's reasonable interpretation would be until after she or he or it has already voted.
Did you say it?
Yeah.
Anyway. So the opposite of this would be reasonability. So basically, the idea of reasonability is just kind of giving a reasonable response to the theory shell rather than, an in-depth interpretation violation, all of this stuff. Just kind of giving a more, I guess persuasive like essay format rather than specific the structure of a theory shell.
Yeah. So competing interp is often known to be like more flow. All right, so next is reasonability. This is like the idea that the judge should be allowed to use their own reason to justify an interp. This relies on the judge always being reasonable with theory and is considered subjective. But some would contend that this subjectivity makes it good. There is definitely an argument to say that it's good for fighting frivolous theories. So, like, look at our example. You might say prefer reasonable. This would be like more read as a response to competing interps, but prefer reasonability as it enables the judges to shut down frivolous theory in the case of abusive theory debaters. So, like, let's say you have an insanely good LDR versus a decent LDR, but that insanely good LDR is extremely good at, like, running frivolous theory, which, like, people get to, like, quarters of TOC as of, like, a decade ago, just reading frivolous theory. But, like, reasonability would allow the judge to be like, that argument is stupid. Just because he is a good debater doesn't necessarily mean that I think it's reasonable.
So sorry.
Yeah, we'll just keep going. All right. Finally, reverse voting issues. Probably the biggest
Yes,
deal.
this is huge.
You want to go? Yeah, I'll explain. All right, so the idea of a reverse voting issue is that if you lose the theory shell, like you gain no offensive off of it, like they beat your shell, you should lose the round. There are multiple implications for RVIs or why RVIs shouldn't exist, so this is definitely going to be its own independent video, but just to sum it up, here's an example. Theory is an RVI, or if they lose theory, it's a reverse voting issue, as they are necessary to prevent the proliferation of frivolous theory debaters. RVIs increase the risk of running theory even if the debaters only lose on a single shell, it means losing the entire round. This is an active deterrent. So what this generally means is that you won't run a bad argument, especially theory, because anyone who can just like very easily just put like a dump to it, or like even like meh arguments, if they can just convince the judge that you don't gain offense off the shell, you lose the entire round. Because
And so this goes into another RVI that people use, which is the idea that because when you read a theory shell, it is offense that if you don't win theory, then no harm, no foul. But if you do win theory, you win the round. So a lot of teams say this is unfair, and such say if they lose theory, they should lose the round because inherently without that, there's no reason not to run theory. So there's no penalty. Very low risk, very high reward. And so people say that as a result of that, you should actually vote them down for running theory. And so that's just another reverse voting issue.
yeah, I believe in these because I want PF to not be absolutely terrible. So let's get to some examples.
But I think one thing is important to consider is there's also another side of RVIs.
Oh, yeah.
Maybe reasons why they aren't as good.
Yeah.
So one that is commonly said, is
We'll go back.
you don't win for proving you didn't cheat, right? So the idea is that this the logic behind the argument is flawed because you shouldn't gain a benefit from proving you didn't do something wrong, right? That doesn't make sense. That doesn't interact with how our society operates. So that's a common one.
And it also could, for example, another common one is when a talented theory debater walks into a round and he knows his opponent isn't near as good at him as running theory, what he can do is he can just bait theory by running what's commonly thought abusive arguments and then reading just a massive amount of dumps against that argument, and he's just able to pretty much bait a win without even having to initiate the theory contest.
Absolutely. And in this context, it makes it impossible to check back very good theory debaters. So then the only ones running theory are, the ones that are very talented, which means that we're really only, the norm setting isn't going both ways because the abuses that they are doing never get checked back because
it's a one-way road, and that's generally known to be unethical and unfair. Again, you can always link back into voters with literally every single kind of argument. Always standards, voters, theory is everything. At some point, you have to justify an action via theory. All right, so let's look at some examples of some theory shells. They're not necessarily very quality due to some. I was just in a rush to make this. Yeah. So here we go. This is our first theory shell. It's the idea that spreading in PF would be bad. So we set out our interpretation or rule, which is that debaters must not spread in public forum. And we say that our opponent is using excessive speed. Now, this is a very good example of when it's hard to really point out a violation. Sometimes, like with this kind of argument, I would probably say prefer reasonability because it's very hard to define spreading, and also it's like a very non-falsifiable claim. You can't really prove what words per minute they were talking at. So, in this case, I would say prefer reasonability. You'll just have to really be confident with your shell to win.
Mm-hmm.
And then,
so these are a lot more like specific standards that aren't as common. Predictability. So that one actually is one that will come up somewhat often. It's the idea that if I cannot predict this argument for whatever reason, or I can't like comprehend this argument right, then
how do I
respond to it, right? If someone is not like ready or prepared for the like an excessive level of speed, then they are at a structural disadvantage through the round, and it makes it far more difficult and less educational or less fair.
Yeah, so like let's see like how we use predictability in here. So like our warrant is predictability. I have to write my case before I come into the round. I can't possibly predict how our opponents are going to deliver their arguments, so I can't preempt their use of speed. If I simply engage in speed from the beginning, I open myself up to all of these new arguments against speed. If I don't read fast, however, I can easily get spread out of the round by the negative debater. There's no way for me to win, and this abuse happens before the round even starts. When they use speed, they perpetuate their structural advantage because as the threat of speed ceases to exist, so does the advantage. You should reject the debater because doing so delegitimizes the use of excessive speed in round and ensures that debate as an activity cannot lead down a path of intrinsic and unfairness. So pretty much that last part, this you should reject the debater, can also just be like terminalization that you include under the drop the debater. So sanitizing horror is more of a critical argument. I haven't really fleshed that one out, but it's just an example of how you can really reach beyond like what you consider normal arguments with theory. You can really change the way people interact with what they consider ethical and ensure that really the best norms get preserved. Because if it's a good norm, there's a reason why it's good. So you can run that shell and explain why it's better. And if you keep losing, surprise, your norm probably not as good.
Right, and so looking at voters, right, is educate the idea of education and fairness. We think that, or like spreading hurts both of these. So we just say these are ways in which education is very important. If they are harmed, then that's a net detriment. And of course, from that point forward, you would give the implication.
Yeah, so like here I also included like a roll of the ballot. These don't always have to be in theory. In turn, your like drop the debaters in a formal roll of the ballot. But here I have my own roll of the ballot that's like to promote the debate that advocates real world policies. And then I read a card that says debate reinforces substantive democracy education. So pretty much the idea that debate informs us as citizens to be more informed whenever we vote for a policy. So we should at least go from the perspective that will inform us about real policies. We shouldn't be like doing insane arguments that aren't going to be realistic. That's also just like known as realism generally, but we can get to that another time. All right.
So another example, misconstrued theory. So, or the idea of misconstrued evidence theory. This is one that, while it ought to be run more, it's sort of difficult to run.
Also, this one, now due to the more active use of tab room, you can definitely just challenge evidence.
Mm-hmm,
so this is not very much necessary, but if you find yourself not really comfortable with like contacting over an evidence challenge, or like you're not sure if their evidence is really misconstrued and you don't want to be like punished for calling in tab room for something that isn't true, misconstrued theory can actually make y'all debate whether or not that evidence was correctly cut, which in the long term I think is going to be better than the rest of the argument, because you're always going to be deploying skepticism anyway. We might as well get out of the way and at least engage in some real clash.
Right, and I think there's a couple ways in which this argument isn't the most advantageous to run. One, because a lot of times you don't really realize that the evidence is misconstrued until later in the round, at which point you don't really have the time to run a complex theory shell.
Yeah.
But second is also that in a lot of ways disclosure checks back and more, right? Because disclosure evidence is out there. People are going to know if your evidence is bad, and it disincentivizes you from running that evidence. But also, it allows you to call out their evidence earlier in the round and make it a bigger point in the round. But also, it means that I don't know. I think the benefits sort of are just of this and multiplied, right? Because you get a lot better research. You know, a lot of people can benefit, more inclusive. So I don't know. But it is a one that is talked about a lot and does come up because, you know, like people misconstrue evidence and it sucks, and it's a way to check back against that. So it is good.
Yeah.
One theory shell that's been increasing in usage, especially here on the Texas circuit, is paraphrasing theory.
Oh, yeah.
So we don't have a shell for this right now, but the idea is that debaters must not or may not paraphrase their evidence. And the idea behind this would be this leads to debaters skewing the author's point of view, what the argument is saying, and a lot of times can eventually encourage complete, you know, just misconstruing of evidence because, you know, who's going to check back against them? They don't have the card, and you get to read it however you would like. And so, you know, the problem with this would be, like, the standards in this scenario are like evidence comparison, right? And evidence comparison, because, you know, it's much harder to compare paraphrased evidence because you have to like call for it a lot as well, which also increases time skew. Because anyway, that one's becoming very common, and I know a lot of people don't like paraphrase. A lot of people do paraphrase. That's a pretty heated debate on the circuit right now.
We'll definitely also have like videos over certain theory norms, like things like paraphrasing. But just for like y'all's information, paraphrasing, I personally believe belongs or should be allowed in PF because of its like general purpose of like making intense academic literature more understandable to the average person, which is the purpose of the event. Now, of course, this also means that you'd have to like beat their education warrant. But the truth is, reading verbatim, or like the definition of verbatim that most of these theory shells abide to, means that you can also just do straw man quoting, which is the idea that you're not actually translating what the author's intent was. Instead, you're actually misconstruing what the author said by like getting rid of one word, like not or no. I know I said not twice. It's just not is just such a common one.
Yeah. So like if it says India and Pakistan will not go to war, but someone says India and Pakistan will go to war.
Because they just like don't highlight not.
So
like,
that's a way in
paraphrasing doesn't completely solve. You can definitely get around the issue of paraphrasing in verbatim reading out of card. And also like there's the idea that some people really cannot read out of cards, like it makes it harder for them, and there is always ableism arguments on every theory shell, so be ready for those. But the idea that you should never like disadvantage a handicapped person in debate, there's plenty of warrants why. So whenever you're like thinking of your responses, just be careful not to violate other ethics. Be the like highest, you're taking the highest road all the time.
All right, so I think we've gotten through a lot of specifics at this point, but I think just to like sum up the idea of what theory is and to make it more palatable, I think you should look at it as, you know, the claim, warrant, impact of your normal cases, but then kind of translate it to theory. So the claim, you know, that is the interp, right? The claim you're making, you know, China or the European Union would fund the Belt and Road Initiative, right? That is kind of your, you know, debaters.
You're establishing what you consider to be true.
So your violation would be, you know, some way in which you prove this argument true, like the uniqueness. So that would be like, right now Europe is not funding because they have not joined, so they can't fund, right? It's that sort of thing. Like tying in the
there
claim.
Isn't like necessarily a very clear connection to violation, but violation's like one of the more simple ones. You just have to show that like they broke the interpretation. That's all. You're setting a rule. You have to show how they broke the rule. There's no real way to teach this in a standard like prep out response. It's definitely better to just do it on a case-by-case basis.
But with standards, you know, that's your traditional warranting, right? European Union joins the Belt and Road Initiative, and as such, they would increase funding for green infrastructure because Europe is much more conscious about the environment, right? That would be your warrant. Similar to standards, you know, disclosure increases our ability to clash because if we both understand each other's cases on a greater level, because we can see their evidence, this means that we get a higher quality debate, and as such, we get more education out of it, right? So the warrant for what you're saying. And then, you know, voters is basically
an impact, an unterminalized impact. Yes. So like that's like saying econ growth. That doesn't link into like util. You have to actually terminalize econ growth into like deaths or poverty, something that actually links into any like framework. Because econ growth is like not it's like pretty nebulous, just like education and fairness. Like, what does the judge do after that?
Right, and so that's where you get into like the terminalization of drop the debate or drop the argument. Why does this impact matter? Contextualize it. And so I think in that vein, when you look at it and do kind of a comparison, theory is not that different from our traditional debate. I think in a lot of ways it's much less complicated if you can if you really try to analyze each part of it and try to understand it on a deeper level. I think it's very beneficial. It's just a different kind of debate, one that's arguably more accessible. And yeah, so I think this is gonna wrap things up, but we're going to leave our emails in the description. You can find us on Facebook for any questions you may have. If you want to talk about theory or anything like that, we're super happy to. And so this was the first of the PF Forward podcast, and we'll see you soon.
Yeah.